Welcome, everyone, to Strategic Labs. If you are joining us today for this deep dive, please take a quick second to leave a like, share the episode, and subscribe. It really helps us out. I want you to picture this. It is 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the communication networks for the wealthiest, most powerful people in Riyadh just go entirely dark.
Yeah, and we are not talking about a dropped signal or a localized glitch.
Right, exactly. This was a targeted military-grade blackout. And within hours, you have billionaires, powerful government ministers, and even prominent members of the royal family locked inside the Ritz-Carlton. Literally, a five-star hotel turned into a gilded cage.
It's just wild to think about.
It really is.
Yeah.
And there were no formal charges presented in a courtroom, no public trials, just this sudden, terrifying shift in the tectonic plates of power.
And, that moment perfectly encapsulates this massive shift in how statecraft actually operates in the 21st century. We are looking at a methodology where the most devastating maneuvers, they happen entirely off the public ledger.
Which brings us to the core of our deep dive today. We are pulling apart Edward H. Whitmore's 2026 book, Covert Operations Series - Saudi Arabia, Intelligence, Influence, and the Hidden Power Behind Strategic Alliances.
It is a hefty read, but man, it is so revealing.
It really is. And our mission today is to completely shatter this simplistic everyday caricature of Saudi Arabia that you always see on the news. The idea that it's just this wealthy desert monarchy pumping oil and acting as this passive, checkbook-wielding sidekick to Western powers.
Right, because Whitmore argues something far more complex.
Exactly. And just a quick disclaimer before we really get into the weeds here. Whitmore touches on some highly charged geopolitical strategies, and we want to make it abundantly clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking any political sides here, left-wing, right-wing, whatever. We are strictly here to impartially report and analyze the thesis laid out in Whitmore's book. We are just the messengers trying to convey these ideas.
Absolutely. Our goal at Strategic Labs is just to unpack the text. And Whitmore's main thesis is that Saudi Arabia has realized a fundamental truth about modern geopolitics. Basically, that visibility is a profound liability.
Explain that a bit more. What does he mean by visibility being a liability?
Well, if your enemies, or even your allies for that matter, if they can see your forces massing, they can counter them. So the kingdom has spent decades architecting this entirely new paradigm of statecraft. For them, true strength is their capacity to steer global events invisibly.
So they're choosing covert influence and financial leverage over, open military confrontation.
Exactly. They are basically avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible.
Which means we really have to reevaluate how we measure power today. To understand how they wield this invisible influence, we have to look at the engine room, right? The architects behind the curtain. And Whitmore points us directly to the General Intelligence Presidency, the GIP.
The GIP, yeah. And to really grasp what the GIP is today, the book points out that we have to go back to a very specific, incredibly traumatic wake-up call for the Saudi state.
Right, the 1979 siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca.
Yeah. The events of November 1979 fundamentally rewired the Saudi state's approach to its own survival. You had hundreds of heavily armed, ultra-conservative militants violently seizing the holiest site in Islam.
Led by Juhayman al-Otaibi, if I remember correctly.
That's right, and they held it for 2 weeks. But Whitmore says what is critical to understand here isn't just the religious or the political shock of the event, it was the absolute catastrophic failure of their intelligence network.
Because the Saudi security apparatus was completely blind, weren't they?
Completely. They had no idea this massive plot was brewing right under their noses.
How does a state that powerful miss something that huge?
Well, Whitmore explains that they were blind because, at the time, Saudi internal security was totally fragmented. It was this patchwork of reactive tribal alliances and disjointed ministries. The monarchy essentially relied on this informal network of loyalty rather than having a modern, proactive intelligence apparatus.
So they were basically just waiting for things to happen.
Right. And the shock of having to eventually bring in French commandos just to help retake their own holy site, that catalyzed a massive structural overhaul. The royal family realized that reacting to threats meant they were already losing. They had to get ahead of them. They had to preempt them.
Okay, so they build the GIP. But Whitmore makes a point to say they don't build it the way a Western democracy builds an intelligence agency, right? Let's look at the CIA or MI6.
Yeah, that is a really crucial distinction in the book.
Because those Western agencies, They have layers of bureaucratic insulation. They have congressional or parliamentary oversight committees. They have legal mandates they have to tiptoe around. The GIP bypasses all of that.
Completely bypasses it.
It is tethered directly, and I mean exclusively, to the king and the crown prince.
That direct tether is the defining characteristic of Saudi intelligence, according to this deep dive into the sources. Historically, the directors of the GIP, figures like Prince Turki bin Faisal or Prince Bandar bin Sultan, they were not just career intelligence officers who climbed some bureaucratic ladder.
Right, they were literally senior members of the royal family.
Exactly. They were royal insiders executing the monarch's direct will. So there is zero separation between the state intelligence apparatus and the personal survival and ambitions of the House of Saud.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It reminds me less of a traditional government agency
Right.
and more of the concept of dark pools in high-frequency financial trading.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, because in a dark pool, you have these massive market-moving trades happening entirely off the public exchange. The regulators, the public, they only see the trade after it has been executed and the market has already shifted. It feels like the GIP allows the crown to make these massive geopolitical trades in total darkness with zero bureaucratic drag.
That is a perfect analogy for what Whitmore is describing, because the elimination of that bureaucratic drag grants the kingdom an operational agility that Western agencies often really struggle to match.
Because there's no red tape.
Right. Intelligence flows straight into the royal court, and executive orders flow straight back down to the field operatives. They can pivot incredibly fast.
But there has to be a downside to that, right?
Well, yeah. The structural vulnerability of a dark pool, to use your analogy, is that the entity executing the trade holds all the risk. Because there is no oversight committee or rogue bureaucratic faction to blame when things go wrong. Every covert action and the diplomatic blowback if an operation fails, it is tied intimately and undeniably to the throne itself.
Wow, that is a massive gamble.
It is.
So they have mastered internal control through this hyper-centralized intelligence apparatus. And going back to that Ritz-Carlton purge of 2017 we mentioned at the start, that proves they can silence threats at home without a shot being fired in the street.
It was a masterclass in internal control.
But let's actually dig into the mechanics of how they built the intelligence mosaic that made a night like that possible. Because Whitmore breaks down their surveillance ecosystem into three distinct pillars, right?
He does. And the first pillar he identifies is electronic intelligence, or SIGINT. But Whitmore says we have to move past the idea of just, tapping a phone line. The GIP utilizes cutting-edge, zero-click exploits.
Wait, zero-click? This is where a target's phone is compromised without them ever even clicking a malicious link, right?
Yes, exactly. The book details how tools like Pegasus, which are developed by these private cyber intelligence firms, they allow operatives to infect a device completely silently.
That is terrifying.
It is. And once they are inside, they aren't just reading encrypted chats. They turn the device into a live environmental microphone. They track location metadata to map out a target's entire physical network.
So they know exactly who you meet with.
Who you meet with, how often, for how long, everything.
Which, I imagine, feeds directly into the second pillar Whitmore outlines, which is human intelligence, or humind. Because it's one thing to track metadata, but it's another to have physical eyes in the room.
Right, human assets are still crucial.
And Whitmore details how the GIP embeds informants not just in hostile organizations, but inside the kingdom's own elite circles. Universities, boardrooms, private social gatherings.
Yeah, the book notes that it breeds a state of absolute paranoia. Your business partner or your cousin could literally be the one logging your complaints about economic policy.
But the text suggests that paranoia is a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. It isolates potential dissidents because no one trusts anyone else. But the third pillar is really where Whitmore says the GIP distinguishes itself, and that is predictive psychological profiling.
Predictive profiling, like stopping a crime before it happens.
Sort of, yeah. The intelligence apparatus isn't merely cataloging actions. They are actively analyzing the psychodynamics of the elite. They map financial pressures against tribal rivalries and personal grievances.
So they're looking for weaknesses.
They are looking for the psychological tipping point of a specific prince or a billionaire. The goal is to identify that point, allowing the state to neutralize the threat before the individual even consciously decides to act against the crown.
Okay. But I have to push back on the strategy here based on what we're reading. If the monarchy possesses this absolute panoptic view of their society, and they hold all the structural power, why bother with the theater?
What do you mean by theater?
Well, the November 2017 crackdown, the Ritz-Carlton thing, it was meticulously branded to the global public as an anti-corruption campaign. Why go through that PR hassle? If you have absolute power, why not simply declare, I am the crown prince, you are a threat to my consolidation of power, and you are going to prison?
That is a really great question, and it touches on a core concept in Whitmore's analysis, which is the illusion of absolute power.
The illusion.
Yeah. Whitmore argues that even an absolute monarchy is constrained by the need for performance legitimacy. The Saudi ruling class is not a monolith. It is this highly delicate web of competing tribal loyalties, religious authorities, and massive economic conglomerates.
So if you just start arresting rival princes without a narrative.
You shatter the illusion of a unified royal family. You risk triggering a systemic fracture. You might spark an internal coup or widespread economic panic.
Oh, I see.
So by framing the purge as a necessary anti-corruption drive, the GIP provided a digestible narrative. It terrified the internal elites into complete submission because, let's face it, everyone knows someone who operates in the gray areas of state contracting.
Right.
But crucially, it gave Western investors and the domestic public a storyline of modernization and reform. Whitmore calls it political brinkmanship, utilizing intelligence as the scalpel and public relations as the anesthetic.
The scalpel and the anesthetic. That is a powerful way to put it. So they've mastered internal control. The Ritz-Carlton proves they can silence threats at home. But you can't use jamming devices and hotel arrests on a foreign army.
No, you definitely cannot.
So how does a kingdom that is so terrified of direct military conflict handle a heavily armed ideological rival like Iran?
Well, the book explains that this is where the internal apparatus is exported. The rivalry with Iran is arguably the defining geopolitical fault line of the modern Middle East. And Whitmore points to January 2016 as the moment this conflict escalated from a Cold War into an aggressive, albeit covert, shadow war.
January 2016. That was the execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, right? A very prominent Shia cleric inside Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And Whitmore argues this wasn't just some domestic judicial matter. He frames it as a calculated geopolitical trap.
A very calculated trap. Saudi intelligence understood the psychological profile of the Iranian leadership perfectly. They knew that executing a high-profile Shia cleric would provoke an explosive, highly emotional reaction from Tehran.
And it did. I mean, Iranian protesters literally stormed and burned the Saudi embassy in Tehran.
Exactly. Which gave Riyadh the absolute perfect justification to sever all formal diplomatic ties. They forced Iran into looking like the chaotic aggressor on the international stage.
So they baited them.
They absolutely baited them. And with diplomatic channels officially dead, the battlefield shifted entirely to the shadows, most notably in Yemen.
Right. And when we look at the Yemen conflict through the lens of Whitmore's research, the mechanics of Saudi warfare look entirely different from what we usually expect.
How so?
Well, we usually think of war as logistics, right? Moving tanks, establishing supply lines, conducting airstrikes. And while Saudi Arabia did conduct a massive air campaign, the actual ground war was managed very differently according to the sources.
Because direct, state-on-state ground warfare is incredibly costly. It requires immense public support, and it exposes a nation's core infrastructure to retaliatory strikes. Whitmore outlines that the Saudi strategy in Yemen, which was orchestrated largely through the GIP, was to basically outsource the bleeding.
Outsource the bleeding.
Yeah. They built a massive, complex network of proxies to fight the Iranian-backed Houthis.
Let's break down the mechanics of that outsourcing for the listener. How do you actually fight a war without your own troops on the ground?
According to Whitmore, you weaponize capital. The GIP utilized deep financial inducements to secure the loyalty of specific Yemeni tribal leaders. We are talking about highly targeted bank transfers, weapons shipments, and logistical support funneled directly to local militias and mercenary groups.
So they are literally purchasing localized influence?
Exactly. They are purchasing influence to counter Iranian expansion mile by mile without risking Saudi infantry.
And Whitmore shows this isn't isolated to Yemen either.
No, it's a regional strategy.
Right. In Lebanon, he details how Saudi intelligence focuses intensely on financial tracking. They map out the Hawala networks.
Right. Those are the informal, paperless money transfer systems.
Exactly. The systems that Hezbollah uses to move funds and secure arms.
Mm-hmm.
And then in Syria, during the height of the civil war there, the GIP funded and armed very specific, vetted opposition factions.
And it is important to note what Whitmore says about their goals there. Their goal wasn't necessarily to build some utopian democracy in Syria.
No, not at all. Their goal was to bleed out Iranian resources and
Mhm.
undermine the Assad regime's stability.
Right. The operative mechanism across all these theaters is plausible deniability. The grand strategy here is attrition.
Hmm.
You bog your rival down in multiple expensive, unwinnable quagmires across the entire region.
Because Iran has to spend billions propping up Assad, funding the Houthis, and arming Hezbollah.
Exactly. By managing this resistance through proxies, Saudi Arabia achieves its strategic goals while avoiding the catastrophic economic and infrastructural damage that a direct military confrontation with Iran would guarantee.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, though. Plausible deniability only exists as long as you remain deniable. The entire shadow war strategy relies on the invisible hand staying invisible. So what happens when the operators step into the light? Which brings us to a major inflection point in the book, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah. Whitmore frames the Khashoggi operation in October 2018 as a catastrophic systemic failure. It is the exact moment where Saudi Arabia's covert methodology collided violently with the realities of the modern world.
Let's walk the listener through the timeline of that, because the premeditation is what makes the intelligence failure so glaring in the source text.
It really does.
Jamal Khashoggi, who is a former Saudi insider turned very vocal critic living in the U.S., he goes to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul just to obtain routine marriage documents. And Whitmore details how a specialized GIP team was flown in directly from Riyadh.
And they didn't come to negotiate with him?
No. They
Oh.
brought forensic experts, they brought communication intercept devices, they brought a bone saw.
It was an operation that felt incredibly anachronistic, according to the book. Sending a physical hit squad to a foreign consulate to eliminate a dissident, I mean, that is a tactic straight out of the Cold War.
Right, in the 1980s, an operation like that might have just resulted in a missing persons report and endless, unprovable rumors.
Exactly. But the GIP completely failed to account for the environment they were operating in.
The book calls it a collision of eras. It's the analog brutality of the 1980s meeting the radical transparency of 2018.
Because the environment had fundamentally changed, Turkish intelligence had thoroughly compromised that Saudi consulate with audio bugs. Open source intelligence analysts and global media outlets, they literally used commercial flight radar data to track the private jets carrying the assassination team in real time.
Real time. That is crazy.
And biometric passport data and thermal imaging rendered all of the operatives' aliases completely useless. The kingdom basically attempted to deploy this old-school, centralized intelligence directive in an era where digital footprints are permanent and universally accessible.
But I want to challenge the long-term impact of this, based on what we are reading.
Okay.
Did this actually fundamentally damage Saudi power? I mean, if we look at the immediate aftermath, sure, there was a massive global outcry, corporations pulled out of investment conferences, politicians issued angry press releases, but within a year or two, the U.S. and European powers were right back at the table. Weapons sales continued. The oil kept flowing. It looks like their financial leverage shielded them from any real lasting consequences.
It is definitely tempting to look at the persistence of those alliances and conclude there was no real damage. However, Whitmore argues that while the macro alliances survived due to structural dependencies, primarily Western reliance on global oil stability and regional counterterrorism operations, the operational damage to Saudi Arabia was actually profound.
Because they lost the invisibility cloak.
Exactly. The operation proved to the world that the GIP was willing to execute lethal, highly reckless operations on the sovereign soil of a NATO ally against a journalist. That realization forced a massive recalibration within international intelligence communities.
Right, they couldn't just brush it off behind closed doors.
No, Western agencies, including the CIA and MI6, they had to severely reassess the operational risk of sharing sensitive data or coordinating operations with the GIP. Saudi Arabia became temporarily radioactive in the intelligence world.
So they had to rebuild trust.
They had to spend billions of dollars restructuring their intelligence apparatus, reshuffling leadership, and launching massive global lobbying campaigns just to claw back to the baseline of trust they had prior to 2018. Whitmore emphasizes that the reputational tax of getting caught was astronomical.
So you have the Khashoggi fallout severely constraining your diplomatic maneuvering. You have the Yemen proxy war dragging on, becoming this huge PR nightmare. When the kinetic physical intelligence operations fail, or they become just too risky, how does the state project power?
Well, Whitmore suggests this is exactly when Saudi Arabia pivoted hard to its silent weapons.
Financial leverage, oil market manipulation, and global information control.
Right. And to understand these silent weapons, we first really have to understand the Saudi philosophy on alliances. Because in the West, political rhetoric often frames alliances as these partnerships built on shared democratic values or deep historical bonds.
Right, the whole special relationship idea.
But Saudi Arabia, according to the text, they approach alliances with a strict, unsentimental transactionalism.
It is a contract, not a friendship.
Exactly. They provide intelligence sharing, massive multi-billion-dollar arms purchases that subsidize Western defense industries, and a guarantee to stabilize global oil markets. And in exchange, they expect the United States to act as the ultimate security guarantor in the Persian Gulf.
But they refuse to be solely dependent on that American contract, right?
Yeah.
Whitmore highlights how Riyadh aggressively hedges its bets.
Oh, absolutely. They are simultaneously deepening economic and energy ties with China and expanding strategic partnerships with India. They are basically building a multipolar safety net for themselves.
And the primary vehicle for that global hedging is the Public Investment Fund, the PIF.
Yes, the PIF is crucial.
And this is where the statecraft really intersects with you, the listeners' daily life. Think about the apps on your phone right now. The ride-sharing app you took to the airport, the social media platform you scroll through, the video game publisher that makes your favorite game. The PIF has injected hundreds of billions of dollars into Silicon Valley tech firms, global logistics networks, and massive asset managers like BlackRock.
And while the stated goal of the PIF is to diversify the Saudi economy away from fossil fuels, Whitmore details the incredible geopolitical utility of these investments. It creates what political scientists call weaponized interdependence.
Weaponized interdependence. Wrap your head around that.
It's a wild concept. By embedding the Saudi sovereign wealth fund so deeply into the foundational architecture of the Western economy, Riyadh creates an immense deterrent against sanctions.
Because if Washington or Brussels decides to heavily sanction Saudi Arabia over, say, human rights or a rogue intelligence operation, they aren't just punishing Riyadh. They would literally be triggering a liquidity crisis in their own tech sectors and threatening the returns of their own citizens' pension funds.
Right. The economic entanglement itself becomes a geopolitical shield. But while capital is their shield, Whitmore is very clear that oil remains their most devastating offensive weapon. And he points out that they don't use it by hoarding it.
No, they use it by flooding the market.
Exactly.
We saw this play out in 2016 and again dramatically in 2020.
Yeah.
The traditional logic is that a producer wants the price of their product to be as high as possible, obviously. But Riyadh deliberately orchestrated massive production surges to crash the global price of oil.
And to understand the mechanics of this weapon, you have to look at a concept the book introduces called the fiscal break-even price.
Explain that for us.
It is the price per barrel of oil a specific country needs to balance its national budget. Saudi Arabia has some of the lowest extraction costs on the planet. They can financially survive, at least in the short term, with oil prices dropping significantly.
But their rivals can't.
Right. Take Iran, for example. Iran's economy is already choked by Western sanctions. They rely heavily on oil revenue to fund state operations, and that massive network of regional proxies we talked about. Iran's fiscal break-even price is substantially higher than Saudi Arabia's.
So by flooding the market.
By flooding the market and driving the price of a barrel down to, say, $30 or $40, Riyadh literally forces Tehran to bleed through its foreign currency reserves just to keep the lights on. It is economic warfare orchestrated through market manipulation.
They suffocate the Iranian war machine without ever crossing a border or firing a single missile.
Exactly. And the book notes they used the exact same tactic in 2020 during OPEC negotiations to punish Russia for failing to agree to production cuts. They briefly triggered this devastating price war that forced Moscow right back to the negotiating table.
So they can manipulate the global economy. But what happens when their own critical infrastructure is hit?
That is the ultimate stress test.
Right, because in September 2019, highly coordinated drone and missile strikes hit the Abqaiq and Khurais oil facilities in Saudi Arabia.
The crown jewels of Saudi Aramco.
Exactly. and the attack temporarily knocked out half of the kingdom's entire oil production. On paper, this should have been a moment of profound humiliation for them. I mean, it exposed the vulnerability of their most vital assets, despite the billions they spent on Western air defense systems.
And a traditional state might have reacted defensively, minimizing the damage or immediately lashing out militarily. Instead, the Saudi state apparatus pivoted to their third silent weapon, which is massive information control and perception management.
Whitmore details how they just flooded the information zone. They deployed automated bot networks across social media to amplify specific narratives. They utilized state-linked media, and they leveraged relationships with compromised international analysts.
Because the goal was to shape the global perception of the attack before their rivals could frame it as a Saudi military failure.
And it worked.
It really did. They successfully anchored the narrative not around the failure of Saudi Patriot missile batteries, but around the recklessness of Iranian aggression threatening the global energy supply.
They completely flipped the script. They transformed a domestic infrastructural failure into an international crisis that demanded global solidarity with Riyadh.
It was incredibly effective. They controlled the narrative environment so thoroughly that dissent and views on Saudi military competence were just completely drowned out.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at the genesis of the modern GIP, following the catastrophic intelligence failures of 1979 in Mecca, seeing how the kingdom built this hyper-centralized intelligence apparatus answering only to the crown. We explored the mechanics of domestic control, utilizing zero-click spyware and psychological profiling to execute operations like that Ritz-Carlton purge.
And then we examined how they export that control to fight shadow wars against Iran.
Right, utilizing financial inducements and proxy militias in Yemen and Syria to maintain plausible deniability. We analyzed the limits of that deniability through the systemic failure of the Khashoggi assassination, where analog spycraft violently collided with digital transparency. And finally, we unpacked their pivot to silent weapons.
Utilizing the PIF to create weaponized interdependence in the West, manipulating the fiscal break-even price of oil to suffocate rivals, and deploying massive perception management to control global narratives.
It is a lot to take in. And Whitmore leaves the reader with this deeply compelling, unresolved tension at the end of the book. Saudi Arabia has successfully engineered a paradigm of statecraft built on the premise that true power operates in the shadows. They rely on strategic ambiguity, covert leverage, and back-channel influence.
But the shadows are shrinking.
Exactly. We live in an era where commercial satellites provide real-time military intelligence to anyone with an internet connection, where a single leak database can expose global financial networks, and open-source investigators can track covert operatives using, like, fitness app data.
So the lingering question the source leaves us with is whether a kingdom architected around the control of information and the invisibility of its actions can sustainably navigate an increasingly multipolar, hyper-connected world. When radical transparency becomes the default state of global affairs, can a system reliant on the dark pools of geopolitics actually survive the unrelenting glare of the digital age?
That is definitely a question to keep you up at night. So the next time you see a major geopolitical shift on the news, a sudden spike in oil prices, a surprising tech acquisition, or a shift in regional diplomacy, remember to look past the visible pieces on the board. Because the real power, the true architects of those shifts, are almost always operating just outside the frame.
That wraps up our deep dive for today. Thank you so much for joining us on Strategic Labs. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the show, and we will see you next time.